In 2020, we saw many of the plans we made back in January and February get wrecked by a pandemic that has lasted to today. Ministries that we hoped would get started in the middle of the year were unable to get going. Events and gatherings that we look forward to every year either had to be greatly modified or canceled altogether. But despite this strange season in our church, God has still been faithful to us. He has kept the virus from spreading among us here at Calvary. He has given us new families that have joined us in our Sunday gatherings. He has maintained unity among us, even though we haven't been able to meet in a members' meeting for several months. I give praise and thanks to God for all of this. And I pray that He continues to be with us and to bless us. As we look forward to 2021, we plan to do a lot of rebuilding. Rebuilding in many of our ministries, like our music ministry, children's ministry, Sunday school ministry. We also hope to lead in rebuilding many of the holy habits that have probably suffered this past year. Things like reading our Bible every day or daily prayer. But as we build together as a church, what will be our foundation? As we build, where will we start? When Luke 6, verses 46 to 49, Jesus tells us where we ought to build, what our foundation ought to be. Listen to Jesus' words in Luke 6, beginning in verse 46. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when a flood arose, the stream broke against that house and could not shake it, because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the stream broke against it, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. These are the words of the Lord. The only way that we can rebuild our ministries, the only way we can hope to maintain godly habits in our life, is if we set our foundation on Jesus Christ and His Word. What is Jesus saying in these verses? Earlier in chapter 6, He has been teaching His disciples on what it looks like to follow Him. In verse 46, He asks them a question. He says, "Why do you call me Lord? Why do you say you will follow me and then not do what I say?" Jesus recognizes that there are two types of people listening to His words. There are those who have come to Him, who have heard His teaching, and then do what He says. There are also those who have come to Him, who have heard His teaching, and they do not do what He says. To describe these two different people, Jesus tells them a parable. The one who comes to Him, hears His words, and puts them into practice is like a man who builds his house on the rock. A man who digs deep, who pulls aside the soil and the earth and finds a solid rock to place his house. And because his house is built on this firm foundation, when the waters come and the flood rises, that house will not be shaken. It will not be destroyed, but be left standing. This reminds me of a time when my family and I went on a vacation when I was a child to Gulf Shores, Alabama. While we were there, it was expected that a tropical storm would make landfall. I remember one afternoon looking out into the sky and seeing it begin to get dark, and could feel the wind begin to pick up and some rain begin to fall, and we decided it was probably best if we left the beach where we were and went inside the house. And while we were inside the house, I remember looking out, seeing the sky get really dark, feeling the rain begin to pour down on the house, seeing the waves of the ocean rise and crash against the shoreline. But despite the raging storm outside, the house we were in did not move. It did not budge. That was because the builders of the house sunk long beams deep into the earth to give it a solid foundation on the beach. This is what it looks like when you hear God's word and then do what it says. When the storm comes, and it will, you'll be left standing. When pain and loss visit you, you'll not grieve as one who has no hope, but you'll grieve in hope and perseverance, knowing that Jesus will make all things right and new. When you lose your job or get a bad diagnosis from the doctor, you will not be shaken, but you'll endure, knowing that God is with you and that He is working what is best for you even in that suffering. But troubles in this life are not what Jesus is really talking about here when He mentions His waters rising or storms coming. He's talking about coming judgment. And if you have placed your trust in Jesus, if you hear His words and put them into practice, when He returns and you stand before God, you will not be condemned or destroyed, but you will stand justified before God because you have placed your hope, you have laid your foundation on Jesus Christ and His Word. I plead with you, church, read God's Word every day. Hear faithful preaching from your church and seek to live it out. And as you do this, you will lay a firm foundation for yourself and for our church. Jesus then goes on to describe a second builder in verse 49. This man built his house on top of the soil, without a foundation. The result is that when the waters rise and the floods come, that house is swept away. It is completely destroyed and nothing is left. Thinking back about my experience at Gulf Shores, imagine what would have happened if instead of the builders sinking those beams deep into the ground and putting the house on top, they instead decided to build the house on the sandy beach. When the storm came, there would have been serious damage to that house and great harm brought to me and my family. It would probably only take one or two good-sized storms to completely destroy that house. This is what it looks like when you hear God's word and then do not do what it says. When the storm comes, you will fall. When you do not live according to God's word or His commands, you are ultimately telling God that you know best how to live your life, that you know best what to do. Even though this may give some temporary or fleeting satisfaction, when the storms come in life, you will be in deep distress. When someone you love dies or you get laid off from your job, you may begin to doubt whether God is actually good, if He knows what is best for you. Sin begins to creep into your life and take control. And because you do not do what God says, you'll find yourself falling into all kinds of sin and rebellion that leads to ruin. Even in this passage of Luke that we just read, we know that there is someone there who is hearing Jesus' words and does not do them. Earlier in verses 12 through 16 of chapter 6, Jesus goes up to a mountain and prays all night. And when He returns to His disciples, He chooses 12 from among them. In verse 16, we learn who the last disciple is. It says, Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Judas was there in Luke 6, hearing Jesus' teaching, but he did not and would not put it into practice. In John 12:6, we learn that Judas was a thief, that he would help himself to the money that he was put in charge of taking care of. Later, he betrays Jesus to the religious leaders. Jesus is arrested and then crucified. We learn in Matthew 27 that when Jesus is condemned, Judas changes his mind and tries to bring the money he was paid for Jesus' arrest to the religious leaders, but they refuse to take it back. Judas then goes out, buys a field, and hangs himself. If you hear God's word, if you read it every day, but do not live it out, like Judas, you destine yourself for destruction and ruin. And when the end comes and Jesus returns, and you stand before God in judgment, how you lived your life will show that you never truly trusted in Jesus or His Word. Church, Jesus' words are a warning to us, to make us ask ourselves, do I hear God's Word? Do I read the Bible and then do I put it into practice? Do I live in obedience to it? As we come together as a church and begin to build in 2021, may we place our foundation on the rock of Jesus Christ. May we hear His words, read them every day together, and seek to live it out. This is why we are so focused on reading the Bible together in 2021. We want to read God's Word, hear it in preaching, study it together in Sunday school, and hopes to live it out in obedience in how we worship together on Sunday mornings, and how we volunteer and serve in the various ministries throughout our church, and how we become faithful committee members and deacons who care for one another. May we be known as a people who love to hear God's word and do what it says.